I had been ignoring the drip for 3 weeks, maybe longer. It started as something barely noticeable, a quiet plink in the middle of the night when the apartment fell into that deep stillness that only comes after midnight. But by the third week, it had grown insistent, rhythmic. Each drop hit the porcelain with a small, metallic ping that seemed to echo through my small kitchen and burrow into my sleep. I'm not the kind of person who calls for help easily. I research things first. I watch YouTube tutorials with the volume turned low, squinting at grainy footage of someone's hands working beneath a sink that looks nothing like mine. I make lists of tools I might need, check prices at the hardware store, convince myself I can handle alone. But this leak lived somewhere I couldn't reach, somewhere that required knowledge I didn't possess, and after staring at the cabinet beneath my sink for the fourth morning in a row, I finally admitted defeat. The number was on a business card tucked behind my coffee maker, one of those simple white cards with black lettering that someone had left in my mailbox months ago. Bose Repairs. No fancy logo, no website, just a name and a phone number in clean, unpretentious font. I had kept it without knowing why. When I called, his voice was deeper than I expected. Steady. He said he could come by that afternoon if I was home, and something about the way he said it, casual, unhurried, made me feel like I wasn't inconveniencing him. Like fixing my sink was exactly what he wanted to be doing at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday. I spent the morning cleaning, not just the kitchen, but the entire apartment. I folded the throw blanket on my couch, stacked the books on my coffee table into neat piles, wiped down surfaces that were already clean. I told myself it was common courtesy, but the truth was simpler and more embarrassing. I wanted the space to feel worthy of someone else's presence. My apartment was small, quiet, filled with secondhand furniture and the particular kind of order that comes from living alone. I had grown protective of its stillness, but now I felt exposed by it. He knocked exactly when he said he would. 3 short raps, confident but not demanding. When I opened the door, I recognized him immediately, though I couldn't place from where. He was tall, maybe an inch taller than me, with dark hair that looked like he had run his fingers through it and shoulders that filled out his work shirt in a way that suggested years of using his body as a tool. His eyes were the color of coffee, without cream, and when he met mine, I felt a small jolt of recognition that I couldn't explain. "Good afternoon," he said, and his voice carried the same steady quality I had heard over the phone. "I'm Bo." I stepped aside to let him in, suddenly aware of how quiet my apartment was. No music, no television, just the distant hum of the refrigerator and that persistent drip from the kitchen. He moved through my space with an ease that made me feel clumsy by comparison, carrying a worn canvas tool bag that looked like it had seen years of honest work. In the kitchen, he set his bag on the counter and crouched down to examine the cabinet beneath the sink. I stood behind him, watching the way his hands moved over the pipes with practiced familiarity. His fingers were long, calloused in places, and when he turned a joint to test its tightness, the muscles in his forearms shifted beneath his skin. "Looks like the valve seat is worn," he said without looking up. "Easy fix. Should have it sorted in 20 minutes. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. There was something about the certainty in his voice that made me want to believe him. I was used to problems that lingered, complications that revealed themselves only after you thought you had found solution. But Bo spoke like someone who understood how things worked, who could see solutions where I saw only confusion. He worked in a comfortable silence. The only sounds the soft clink of metal against metal and the occasional creak of the cabinet door. I found myself watching the line of his shoulders, the way his shirt pulled slightly across his back when he reached deeper into the space beneath the sink. There was something hypnotic about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who moved through a problem with confidence and precision. Halfway through the repair, he asked me to hand him a wrench from his bag. When I reached for it, our fingers brushed for just a moment, barely a touch, but enough for me to notice the warmth of his skin, the slight roughness of calluses along his palm. I pulled my hand back too quickly, and he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. After 15 minutes, he twisted something deep in the cabinet and stood up, brushing his hands on a rag he pulled from his back pocket. The small ritual of cleaning his hands seemed practiced, automatic, but I found myself watching the way his fingers worked over his palms, methodical, and thorough. "That should do it," he said, stepping back from the sink. "But we should test it to make sure." He moved to stand beside me at the sink, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of soap and something else, sawdust, maybe, or the particular smell of someone who works with his hands. "Go on," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter, more intimate. "Test the water." I reached for the faucet handle, hyper-aware of his presence beside me. When I turned it, the pipes hissed and sputtered for a moment before the water ran clear and steady. No more drip. No more sound except the rush of water hitting the basin. But Bo didn't step away. He stayed there beside me, his shoulder nearly touching mine, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his body like heat from a furnace. The space between us felt charged, electric, as if the air itself had become dense with possibility. I turned off the water, and the silence that followed felt different from the quiet I was used to. It felt full rather than empty, weighted with something I didn't have words for. I could hear Bo breathing beside me, slow and steady, and when I glanced sideways at him, I found his eyes already on me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The kitchen felt smaller than it had that morning, the walls closer, the air thicker. I had the strange sensation that something fundamental had shifted in my apartment, that the simple act of having someone else stand beside me in my kitchen had changed the space in ways I couldn't yet understand. Testing the water had never felt so dangerous. But as I stood there beside Bo, his presence solid and warm beside me, I realized that the danger wasn't in the testing. It was in discovering that I didn't want him to leave. After Bo left, my apartment felt different. Not smaller, exactly, but emptied of something I hadn't realized it was missing. I found myself moving through the rooms with a new awareness of their limitations. The narrow hallway that had seemed perfectly adequate suddenly felt cramped. The kitchen where we had stood together now seemed designed for only one person. The silence I had always found comforting now felt hollow. I am 23 years old, and I have built my life around the luxury of solitude. I work from home as a copy editor, spending my days immersed in other people's words, smoothing out their rough edges, making their thoughts flow more clearly onto the page. It is work that suits me, detailed, methodical, requiring patience and precision. I can lose hours in a single paragraph, adjusting rhythm and meaning until everything sits exactly where it should. My apartment reflects this same careful attention. The books on my shelves are arranged, not alphabetically, but by some internal logic only I understand. Philosophy next to poetry, memoirs beside novels that share similar emotional territories. My furniture is all secondhand, pieces I found at estate sales and thrift stores, chosen not for their matching, but for the way they seem to belong together. A wooden desk with water rings from someone else's coffee cups. A reading chair upholstered in faded blue fabric that feels soft against my skin. A kitchen table for two that I use as workspace, papers spread across its surface in organized stacks. I have always been someone who notices details. The way afternoon light moves across my living room floor. The particular sound my coffee maker makes when the water is ready to boil. The rhythm of my neighbor's footsteps on the stairs each morning at 7:15. But I rarely voice what I observe. I collect these small observations like other people collect stamps or coins, storing them carefully in the quiet spaces of my mind. Living alone has taught me to be self-sufficient in ways that sometimes surprise me. I can spend entire weekends without speaking to another person, sustaining myself on the internal dialogue that accompanies reading and work. I have grown comfortable with my own company, protective of the rhythms I have established. But Bo's presence in my kitchen had disrupted something fundamental about that solitude, had shown me how much space I had been carrying unfilled. I knew who he was, of course. I had seen him around the neighborhood for months, maybe longer. He lived somewhere close. I had spotted him at the corner market, loading groceries into the back of a truck that looked as well-maintained as his tools. There was something about the way he moved through the world that caught my attention. He walked with the confidence of someone who understood his place in it, who could fix what was broken and improve what was merely functional. I had watched him help Mrs. Patterson from the building next to mine load her groceries one afternoon, had seen the way he lifted the heavy bags as if they weighed nothing, the way she smiled at him like he was a grandson rather than a stranger. There had been other moments, too. Him replacing a streetlight bulb that had burned out, him helping someone whose car wouldn't start. Small acts of competence and kindness that I observed from my window, from the careful distance I maintained from most of the world. But in my kitchen, that distance had collapsed. When he told me to test the water, standing so close I could feel the warmth from his body, something had shifted between observation and participation. For the first time in months, I had been fully present in a moment that involved another person, alert to every detail, not just of what I was seeing, but of what I was feeling. Bo was 25, I guessed, though I couldn't be certain. There was something about him that suggested experience beyond his years. The way his hands moved with absolute certainty, the calm way he assessed problems before acting on them. But there was also something younger in his eyes when he looked at me, a curiosity that felt genuine rather than practiced. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being trusted with other people's problems. His work clothes were clean, but worn in the places that suggested regular use rather than occasional necessity. His tool bag showed the careful organization of someone who respected his instruments, who understood that good work required the right equipment properly maintained. But beneath that professional competence, I had sensed something else, a stillness that matched my own, the quality of someone who was comfortable with quiet, who didn't need to fill every silence with words. When he had looked at me across the sink, I felt like he was seeing something I rarely showed to anyone. Not just my face or my kitchen or the careful order of my apartment, but something deeper. The way I moved through my space, the particular quality of attention I brought to small tasks, the reasons I chose to live the way I did. It was as if in the space of 20 minutes, he had understood something about me that I struggled to explain to myself. Now, hours later, I found myself replaying every moment of his visit. The sound of his voice when he introduced himself. The way he crouched beneath my sink with fluid ease. The brush of his fingers when he asked me to hand him the wrench. That final moment when we stood together at the sink, testing water that ran clear and warm, the space between us charged with possibility I didn't know how to name. In my small kitchen, the space between us had felt newly fragile, like something that could shatter if either of us moved too quickly. But it had also felt necessary, essential, like something I had been missing without knowing I was missing it. When Bo told me to test the water, it had felt like more than plumbing. It had felt like permission to want something I had been afraid to acknowledge. After Bo finished with the sink, he didn't immediately reach for his tool bag. Instead, he stood there in my kitchen, hands resting loosely at his sides, looking around the space with the same careful attention he had given to the plumbing. His gaze moved over the books stacked on my counter, the coffee maker tucked into the corner, the single mug sitting in the dish rack. I watched him take in these details of how I lived, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with vulnerability, but rather with being truly seen. "You have good light in here," he said, nodding toward the window above the sink. A lot of apartments in these buildings are dark. I had never thought of my kitchen as particularly bright, but seeing it through his eyes, I noticed how the afternoon sun cut across the white tiles, how it caught the grain in my wooden cutting board. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt inadequate for what felt like a larger observation about the space I had created for myself. He moved toward the window, and I found myself following, drawn by the easy way he occupied my apartment. Outside, the city continued its usual rhythm. Cars moving down the street, people walking with purpose or wandering without it. The ordinary ballet of late afternoon in a neighborhood where people knew each other's faces but rarely their stories. "Must be nice, working from home," he said. "Having your own schedule." I nodded, though I wasn't sure nice was the right word for the particular kind of solitude I had built around myself. It was comfortable, familiar, safe in ways I had learned to value. But standing next to Bo, I felt the weight of all those quiet hours, all those days when the only voice I heard was my own internal dialogue. "What about you?" I asked. "Do you work mostly in the neighborhood?" He turned from the window, and when his eyes met mine, I felt that same jolt of recognition I had experienced when he first arrived. All over, really. But I like the jobs close to home better. Less driving, more time to do the work right. There was something in the way he said it that suggested he took pride in doing things properly, that he understood the difference between a quick fix and a lasting solution. I found myself wanting to know more about his work, about the problems he solved, about the people who trusted him to come into their homes and make things better. I should probably get going, he said, but he made no move toward his tool bag. Instead, he stood there looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Let me make you some coffee first," I said, the words coming out before I had fully decided to say them. He smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from him since he arrived. "That would be nice." I moved around the kitchen with new awareness of his presence, filling the coffee maker with water, measuring grounds into the filter. These were motions I performed every morning without thinking, but with Bo watching, they felt deliberate, significant. When I reached for mugs from the cabinet, he asked if he could help, and I found myself handing him the cream from the refrigerator, our fingers brushing again in the transfer. We stood at my kitchen table while the coffee brewed, talking in the careful way of people who are still learning how to be comfortable with each other. He told me about some of the jobs he had worked recently. An elderly man whose furnace had broken in the middle of winter, a young mother whose hot water heater had flooded her basement. He spoke about his work with genuine interest, describing problems and solutions with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. I found myself telling him about my editing work, about the satisfaction of taking something rough and making it smooth, about the particular challenge of preserving someone's voice while improving their clarity. It was the most I had talked about my job with anyone in months, and I was surprised by how easy it felt to explain what I did to someone who seemed genuinely curious. The coffee finished brewing with a soft click, and I poured it into our mugs, adding cream to mine while he took his black. We settled at the table, and the conversation continued to flow in ways that felt natural despite the newness of it. He asked about the books on my counter, and I found myself explaining why I preferred certain authors, why I arranged my reading in particular orders. He listened with the same attention he had brought to examining my plumbing, as if my preferences were puzzles worth solving. As we talked, I began to understand that this conversation was an invitation. Not explicit, not demanding, but present nonetheless. An invitation to call him again, to find other reasons for him to return, to continue whatever it was we had started in this afternoon of shared coffee and careful attention. When he finally gathered his things to leave, the sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across my kitchen floor. At the door, he paused, looking at me with that same thoughtful expression I had noticed throughout the afternoon. "If anything else breaks, call me first," he said. "Don't wait weeks like you did with the sink." But then he added something that made my pulse quicken. "And if nothing breaks, call me anyway." The words hung in the air between us, more direct than anything either of us had said all afternoon, more honest than I had expected. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to respond. He handed me a second business card, even though I already had one, and I took it knowing I would keep it somewhere different, somewhere closer, like a permission slip for something I hadn't yet learned to name. "Don't wait," he had said. But as I watched him walk down the hallway toward the stairs, I understood that waiting had never been about the sink. Had it? It had been about something else entirely, about the space between wanting something and allowing myself to have it, about the difference between observing life and participating in it. The following Tuesday, I found myself staring at a cabinet door that hung slightly crooked. It had been that way for months, maybe longer. One of those small imperfections you notice and then train yourself to ignore. But now, running my fingers along its misaligned edge, I felt the weight of Bo's words. "Don't wait." I called him that afternoon. His voice carried the same steady quality I remembered, and when I explained about the cabinet door, he said he could stop by Thursday evening if that worked for me. Something about the casualness of his response, as if fixing my cabinet door was exactly what he wanted to be doing after a long day of work, made my chest tighten with something I didn't want to name. When he arrived, he moved through my apartment with the familiarity of someone returning rather than visiting. He set his tool bag on the kitchen counter in the same spot as before, examined the cabinet door with practiced hands, diagnosed the problem in under a minute. "Just needs the hinge adjusted," he said. Simple fix. But this time, I didn't retreat to watch from distance. I stood closer, asked questions about what he was doing, why the door had shifted in the first place. He explained while he worked, his voice patient and unhurried, and I found myself genuinely interested in the mechanics of it all. How it moved with changes in humidity, how screws could loosen gradually over time, how small problems could be prevented with regular attention. When the repair was finished, I made coffee again without asking if he wanted any. He accepted it with that same easy smile, and we settled at my kitchen table as if this had already become our ritual. The conversation flowed more naturally this time, building on what we had started the week before. He told me about a house he was working on, a renovation that would take months, and I found myself imagining him in different spaces, solving different problems, bringing the same careful attention to each task. I told him about a manuscript I was editing, a memoir about growing up on a farm, and how the author's descriptions of physical work reminded me of watching him repair my sink. There was something in the way people wrote about working with their hands that I had never fully understood until I saw him move through a problem with such certainty. The next week, I called about a squeaky hinge on my bedroom door. The week after that, a loose handle on my bathroom cabinet. Each time, Bo came without hesitation, fixed what needed fixing, stayed for coffee afterward. Each time, the repairs took longer, not because the problems were more complicated, but because we found more to talk about while he worked. I learned that he had grown up in a house where things were always breaking, where fixing them yourself wasn't a choice, but a necessity. His father had been a carpenter, his grandfather before that, and Bo had absorbed their knowledge through observation and practice rather than formal training. He spoke about his family with affection, but also with the distance of someone who had needed to leave in order to become himself. He learned that I had chosen my apartment specifically for its quietness, for the way it felt separate from the world without being completely isolated. I told him about the satisfaction of editing, about the pleasure of taking someone else's rough thoughts and helping them find their true shape. I explained how I arranged my books, why I preferred working at my kitchen table rather than the desk in my bedroom, why I had never bought a television. During that fourth visit, while he reattached a curtain rod that had pulled loose from the wall, something shifted between us. We had been talking about the neighborhood, about how it had changed in the years we had both lived here. When he paused in his work to look out the window, "You see everything from up here," he said, gesturing toward the view of the street below. "Not everything," I replied. "Just what happens to be in front of the window. But you notice things," he said, turning back to face me. "Most people don't pay attention the way you do." There was something in his voice that made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to. I had always thought of my observations as private, as something I kept to myself rather than share with others. But Bo seemed to understand that watching wasn't passive for me, that it was a way of caring about the world even when I couldn't participate in it directly. When the curtain rod was secure, we stood together at the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as evening settled over the neighborhood. The silence between us felt different now. Not empty, but full, charged with awareness of how close we were standing, how easy it would be to close the remaining distance between us. "You're always alone in here," Bo said, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm not alone right now," I replied before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air between us, more honest than I had intended to be, more revealing than felt safe. But Bo didn't step away or change the subject. Instead, he turned to face me fully, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. The silence that followed hummed louder than the city outside, filled with possibilities I had been afraid to consider. Standing there at my window with Bo beside me, I realized that something fundamental had changed in the weeks since he had first fixed my sink. These visits had become more than repairs, more than excuses. They had become the rhythm around which I organized my days, the anticipation that gave shape to my otherwise solitary routine. But more than that, they had become the space where I was learning to want something I had never allowed myself to want before. Not just his presence in my apartment, but his presence in my life, in the quiet hours and ordinary moments that made up the days I had been living alone. It happened on a Thursday evening in late October, during what I had told myself would be the last repair I would invent. The handle on my kitchen faucet had begun to stick, requiring more pressure than it should have to turn fully. It was the kind of minor inconvenience that could easily be ignored, but I found myself fixated on it, testing it multiple times throughout the day until I finally called Bo. When he arrived, the sun was already setting, casting my apartment in the golden light that made everything look warmer, more intimate. He examined the faucet with his usual thoroughness, running water, testing the handle's resistance, crouching down to peer beneath the cabinet one more time. "Probably just needs the packing nut tightened," he said. "Won't take long." But I didn't want it to be quick. I had grown to treasure these visits, these stolen hours when my apartment felt alive with another person's presence. I watched him work, noting the concentration on his face, the careful way he positioned his tools, the small adjustments he made until everything moved exactly as it should. As he worked, we talked about our weeks, about the manuscript I was editing and the house renovation he was finishing. The conversation felt easy, familiar, like something we had been doing for years rather than weeks. But underneath it, I felt a tension building, not uncomfortable but expectant, like the moment before thunder when the air itself seems to hold its breath. When he was finished, instead of standing to test the faucet from above, I crouched down beside him beneath the cabinet. The space was cramped, barely large enough for one person, and with both of us there, our shoulders pressed together, our faces inches apart. "Go ahead," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Test it." I reached up to turn the handle, hyper-aware of how close we were, how his breath brushed against my cheek, how the warmth from his body seemed to envelope me in the small, enclosed space. The faucet turned smoothly now, the resistance gone, but I barely registered the success of the repair. All my attention was focused on the moment, on the weight of Bo's presence beside me, on the way the ordinary act of testing water had become something charged with meaning I couldn't ignore. I turned my head to tell him it was working perfectly, and suddenly we were even closer than before, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that when he spoke, I felt his words against my skin. "You don't need something broken to call me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words landed like a confession, like an acknowledgement of what we had both known but hadn't dared to say. All these weeks of invented repairs, of carefully manufactured reasons to see each other, of building connection through the pretense of necessity. He had seen through it all, had understood what I was doing even when I hadn't fully understood it myself. "Then why you keep showing up?" I asked, my own voice unsteady. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching mine in the dim light beneath the cabinet. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to settle deep in my chest. "Because I want to." The honesty of it, the simple directness, took my breath away. There was no pretense in it, no careful maneuvering around the truth. Just want, acknowledged and stated as fact, as something worth acting on rather than hiding from. I had spent so much of my life observing, analyzing, trying to understand the motivations and desires of others, while keeping my own carefully hidden. But hearing Bo speak so plainly about wanting something, wanting me, wanting these moments we created together, made me realize how exhausting it had been to live at such a remove from my own feelings. We stayed there in that cramped space beneath the cabinet, neither of us moving to get up, both of us seeming to understand that something significant was happening, that we had crossed in a territory that couldn't be uncrossed. The ordinary sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, seemed muted, as if the world had narrowed to just this moment, this space, this conversation. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs, could feel the warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the closeness of our bodies and everything to do with the recognition of something I had been afraid to name. This wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly part of it. This wasn't just loneliness seeking relief, though I had been lonely in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. This was want in its purest form, not the careful, analyzed want that I could rationalize and control, but the kind of want that demanded acknowledgement, that insisted on being felt rather than thought about. The kind of want that made me understand why people took risks, why they opened themselves to the possibility of disappointment or heartbreak. Bo reached up then, his hand finding mine where it still rested on the faucet handle. His fingers were warm, slightly rough from work, and when they closed around mine, I felt something inside me give way, some resistance I'd been holding without realizing it, some wall I had built between wanting and having. The words landed heavier than any touch could have, because in that simple statement, I heard an invitation to stop pretending that these visits were about plumbing, to stop hiding behind the convenient fiction of broken things that needed fixing. I heard an invitation to acknowledge that what was happening between us was real, was worth pursuing, was worth the risk of admitting that I wanted it too. I spent the weekend after that evening beneath the cabinet thinking about honesty, about the difference between the careful truths I told myself and the raw truth that Bo had offered without hesitation. Because I want to. 3 words that had upended weeks of careful pretense, that had made it impossible to continue hiding behind broken faucets and squeaky hinges. By Monday, I knew I couldn't sustain the fiction any longer. The apartment felt different now, charged with the memory of that moment, with the weight of words that had been spoken and couldn't be unspoken. I moved through my usual routines, editing, coffee, the quiet rhythm of solitary days, but everything felt suspended, as if I were holding my breath waiting for something to resolve. Tuesday came and went. Then Wednesday. I found myself checking my phone more often than usual, though I couldn't say what I was hoping to see. Bo had never called me. Our contact had always moved in one direction, initiated by my invented emergencies. But now, in the absence of broken things to fix, I felt the strange weight of possibility mixed with paralysis. Thursday evening, I made my decision. When I heard his knock, I felt my heart accelerate in a way that had become familiar over the weeks but felt different now, heavier with intention. I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway with his usual tool bag, but something in his expression suggested he knew this wasn't about repairs. "Nothing's broken," I said before he could speak. The words came out steadier than I felt, but they carried the weight of everything I'd been trying to say since that moment beneath the cabinet. No more pretense. No more careful maneuvering around what we both knew was happening. He studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his eyes, a recognition, maybe, or a relief that matched what I was feeling. Then he stepped inside anyway, setting his tool bag down by the door with a deliberateness that suggested he wouldn't be needing it. The silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet we had grown used to. This silence was expectant, full of acknowledgement and possibility. We stood in my hallway, close enough to touch, but not touching, both of us seeming to understand that we had moved into territory that required different rules. I walked to the kitchen, more out of habit than purpose, and he followed. The space that had become so familiar over our weeks of visits felt transformed now, no longer the site of repairs, but something else entirely, a place where honesty lived, where one could be acknowledged without shame. "Stay," I said, turning to face him. The word came out quietly, but clearly, carrying more weight than any of the careful conversations we had shared over coffee. Not as the plumber. Just, "Stay." I watched his face as he processed what I was asking, what I was offering. There was no surprise in his expression, but there was something deeper, a recognition that we had finally arrived at the moment we had been moving toward through all those carefully orchestrated visits. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he closed the space between us with steps that felt both inevitable and chosen, his hands finding my face with a gentleness that somehow contained all the certainty I had been searching for. When he kissed me, it was slowly, deliberately, like he was solving a problem he had been thinking about for a long time. The kiss tasted like honesty, like all the conversations we had shared over coffee, all the moments of standing close while he worked, all the careful attention we had been paying to each other distilled into this one point of contact. It was nothing like the urgent, desperate kisses I had imagined in my more restless moments, but something quieter and more substantial, a statement rather than a question, an answer rather than a plea. When we broke apart, I felt fundamentally changed, as if some part of me that had been held in careful suspension had finally settled into place. We stood there in my kitchen, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, and I understood that this was what I had been moving toward through all those weeks of invented problems and necessary solutions. "You don't have to break anything to get me to come over," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten with something that felt like gratitude. "I know," I replied, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was telling the complete truth. We spent the rest of the evening on my couch, not talking much, but existing in each other's presence in a way that felt both new and familiar. He fit into my space differently now. Not as someone solving a problem, but as someone choosing to be there, someone who wanted to understand the rhythms of my quiet life, not to fix them, but to be part of them. When he finally gathered his things to leave, much later than usual, he kissed me again at the door. This time it felt like a promise rather than a revelation, like something we could build on rather than something we had to recover from. I watched him walk down the hallway, but this time I didn't feel the hollow emptiness that had followed his previous departures. This time, I felt like something had been completed rather than interrupted, like we had finally stopped pretending and started building something real. Back in my apartment, the silence felt full rather than empty. Not the silence of solitude, but the silence of someone who had finally stopped waiting for permission to want what they wanted, who had finally learned the difference between observing life and living it. 3 weeks have passed since that evening when I finally told the truth. 3 weeks since I opened my door and said nothing's broken. Since Bo kissed me in my kitchen like he was solving the most important problem he had ever encountered. 3 weeks of learning what it means to let someone into the quiet spaces of your life, not because something needs fixing, but because you want them there. The sink still works perfectly. The water runs clear and warm, steady and reliable. The cabinet door hangs straight. The faucet handle turns smoothly. The hinges open and close without protest. Everything Bo repaired during those careful weeks of invented emergencies remains exactly as it should be. My apartment has never been in better working order, but Bo still comes by. Not every day. We both have lives, work, the ordinary responsibilities that shape our separate rhythms. But several times a week, usually in the evening when the light through my kitchen window turns golden and the city begins to settle into its quieter hours. He arrives without his tool bag now, his hands empty except for occasionally bringing coffee from the shop on the corner or flowers from the market, or simply carrying the particular warmth that has become as essential to my apartment as electricity or heat. We have developed new rituals to replace the old ones. Instead of watching him work, I watch him move through my kitchen with the familiarity of someone who belongs there. Instead of making coffee while he fixes something, we make dinner together, learning the small negotiations that come with sharing space. Who stirs while the other chops? How to move around each other in the narrow galley without colliding, whose turn it is to wash dishes. He has learned which mug I prefer in the morning, that I like to read while I eat breakfast, that I work better with natural light than lamps. I have learned that he takes his coffee black, but adds honey to his tea, that he reads more than I expected when I first watch him examine my plumbing, that his hands are gentle even when they're not working. Sometimes we stand together at the sink, side by side, performing the ordinary tasks that make up a shared evening. Washing vegetables, rinsing dishes, testing the water temperature before starting the coffee maker. These moments feel both revolutionary and completely natural. Revolutionary because I spent so many years convinced that my solitude was complete. Natural because having him here has revealed how much space in my life was simply waiting to be filled. Last Tuesday, while we were doing exactly this, standing at the sink after dinner, me washing while he dried, he turned to me and said, "Do you remember that first day when you tested the water?" I remembered everything about that first day. The way he had crouched beneath my cabinet with such confidence. The brush of his shoulder against mine. The moment when he told me to test the water and stayed close enough that I could feel the warmth from his body like a current under my skin. I was terrified, I told him, and it was the truth. Not of him, but of how much I wanted him to stay. "I know," he said, his voice carrying the same gentleness I had heard that first afternoon. "I could see it in the way you moved, like you weren't used to having someone else in your space." The honesty of it, spoken so simply while we stood doing dishes, made my chest tighten with gratitude. Not just for his presence now, but for his patience then, for the way he had moved through those weeks of careful visits without pushing, without demanding more than I was ready to give. We have talked about those weeks often, examining them like artifacts from a previous life. The excuses I invented. The small repairs that became excuses for longer conversations. The way we both knew what was happening, but needed time to find the words for it. Bo has told me that he started looking forward to my calls, that he would find himself hoping something in my apartment would break, just so he would have a reason to see me. But we don't need reasons anymore. On Sunday mornings, we read together on my couch. Him with his book about sustainable building practices, me with whatever manuscript I'm editing that week. Sometimes we talk about what we're reading. Sometimes we just exist in the comfortable silence that I once thought could only be achieved alone. Some evenings, he helps me arrange new books on my shelves, and I watch him consider the invisible logic I use to organize them, occasionally suggesting where something might fit better. His suggestions are always thoughtful, always show that he has been paying attention not just to what I read, but to how I think about what I read. There are still moments when I catch myself marveling at the simple fact of his presence in my apartment. When I watch him make coffee in my kitchen, or see his jacket draped over my reading chair, or notice how naturally he fits into the rhythms I spent years perfecting alone, I feel a wonder that hasn't diminished with familiarity. Testing the water was never really about plumbing. It was about learning to trust that something could work, that the connections we make with other people can be as reliable as properly fitted pipes, as essential as clean water running clear and warm. In the quiet of my apartment, with Bo beside me, I have learned that some kinds of repair work don't require tools. They require honesty, patience, and the willingness to let someone see you clearly enough to understand what actually needs fixing. And sometimes, what needs fixing isn't broken at all. It's just waiting for the right person to help it work the way it was always meant to.